I spent years inside church culture. I've seen the green rooms, the staff meetings, the giving campaigns, the sermon planning, the volunteer pressure, the conference language, the leadership books, and the way ordinary organizational mechanics get baptized as miracles. And once you've seen enough of it, you realize megachurches are not proof that God is moving. They're proof that systems work, even when you're being dishonest about the systems at work. Megachurches don't grow because a God is uniquely moving in one building. They grow because certain systems scale. Branding, emotional engineering, volunteer labor, donor psychology, charismatic authority, stagecraft, leadership pipelines, and organizational control. The tragedy is that these systems are often baptized as anointing, favor, or revival, when in reality they're human mechanisms being treated as divine proof. Before we get into this is not a blanket statement about every megachurch, every pastor, or every person who attends one. There are sincere people in these spaces. There are pastors who mean well. There are members who genuinely find community there. But sincerity doesn't erase systems. What I'm naming here are observable patterns in high growth church culture. Patterns I've seen, patterns I've studied, and patterns I've lived close enough to recognize. And if you don't believe me, this was me just 12 years ago.
But if he didn't do nothing else, right or wrong, he got his mama's attention. Because now she don't want the whole store looking at her like she ain't taking care of her kids. So that she started reaching in her purse.
So let's get started with the one that is the most obvious to me. Megachurch success is manufactured, not miraculous. Megachurches thrive on the narrative that says only God could have done this. The building gets purchased, the church grows, the debt gets paid, and the story becomes look what the Lord has done. But the reality is usually not miracles, it's mechanics. Megachurches grow because systems scale. Branding, stagecraft, emotional engineering, volunteer labor, donor psychology, leadership pipelines, and organizational control. Building a growing organization is not spiritual revelation, it's science. And often the mechanics are hidden long enough to tell a divine story. The church may already have financing lined up, donors committed, lawyers involved, and a property deal already closed. But then the pastor tells the church, we need you to pray, believe, and so God can open this door. This is an impossible task that we can't accomplish without God's hand. A week later, they announce, guess what? God did it. But the door was already open. The deal was already closed. What we're looking at is manufactured providence. The deal was already closed. The money was already positioned. The lawyers were already involved, but the congregation was brought into the story at the prayer stage so the announcement could feel like a miracle. The same thing happens when pastors recover through medical treatment. The church releases prophetic language that conveniently matches the doctor's timeline. And when recovery happens, medicine becomes a background character and a testimony about divine power. That's not just faith, that's attribution management. Megachurches take human planning and call it revelation. They take strategy and call it favor. They take medical recovery and call it healing. They turn promotionals into proof in a world where things are often paid for before they're ever prayed for. The miracle is often just the marketing of the mechanics. Next up on our list, mega churches share the same infrastructure even when they preach different doctrines. One of the clearest signs that megachurch success is mechanical, not miraculous, is that churches with completely different doctrines often operate with the same infrastructure. A prosperity church, a seeker sensitive church, a Pentecostal church, a Calvinist church, and a multicultural evangelical church may argue about theology, but they often run the same playbook. Charismatic central leadership, emotional worship, children's programming, parking teams, small groups, giving systems, sermon series, leadership conferences, volunteer pipelines, media teams, donor strategy, and constant vision casting. That matters because if the theology were the real engine, the systems would look radically different, but they don't. The songs may change, the doctrine may change, the preaching style may change, but the machinery is eerily similar. That tells us the real unifying force is not revelation, it's organizational design. The church growth movement helped make this explicit by turning congregational growth into a field of strategy. Conferences, consulting, publications, leadership models, and repeatable systems for increasing attendance. So when megachurches say God is moving here, the hidden truth is that secular growth systems are working. Continuing to walk this list down, number 8, mega churches are often using organizational psychology, not theology. A lot of what megachurch pastors call vision, leadership, culture, or faith is often organizational psychology dressed in spiritual language. Organizational psychology is the scientific study of human behavior in organizations. It applies psychological principles to optimize member performance, to improve organizational culture, and increase overall organizational efficiency. Experts in this field design strategies to enhance leadership, member well being, and team dynamics. So, megachurch pastors are not just preaching sermons, they're building systems of motivation, belonging, accountability, performance, and identity. When they talk about casting vision, they're often using transformational leadership, creating a compelling future that people emotionally buy into. They're shaping organizational commitment and doing culture formation. When they move people from visitor to member, member to volunteer, volunteer to leader, and leader to donor, they're building a behavioral pipeline and cultivating organizational identity management. And while they're obviously not learning this from the Bible, most pastors are not learning this from organizational psychology textbooks either. They're learning it at church conferences where organizational mechanics are repackaged as biblical revelation. But underneath it is organizational design, how to motivate people, shape identity, manage commitment, reproduce leadership, protect culture, and align behavior around the goals of the institution. That's why the same methods work across churches with completely different doctrines, because the engine is not theology, the engine is organizational psychology. Now, number 7 might surprise you a little bit. The pastor controls the staff more than the congregation. People often assume megachurch pastors control the congregation, but in many cases, the congregation is too large, too fluid, and too consumer driven to control directly. The average member can leave whenever they want. They can stop attending, they can switch churches, watch online, stop giving, or just quietly disappear. But staff can't move that freely. The real control is often concentrated behind the scenes over the paid staff, the volunteer leaders, stage access, and who gets trusted with proximity to the pastor. The congregation experiences inspiration, the staff experiences pressure. Because for staff, this is not just a church, it's their job. It's their income, their insurance, their reputation, their spiritual identity, and often their entire social world. So when the pastor says, protect the vision, or honor the house, or don't touch the anointed, or stay aligned, that language doesn't land the same way on staff as it does on Sunday attendees. For the congregation, it may sound like spiritual encouragement. For staff, it can become a control system. Megachurch pastors may not control every member in the seats, but they often control the people who control the experience those members receive. All right, number 6, megachurch pastors get degrees after the church grows, not before they started pastoring. A lot of people assume megachurch pastors became credible because they were deeply trained in theology, but in many cases, the platform came first. The church grew, the brand expanded, the pastor became influential. Then the degrees, titles, honorary doctorates, leadership programs, or theological credentials came later. That matters because many megachurches are not built as seminary informed institutions. They're built around charisma, communication, organizational momentum, and the pastor's ability to gather people. This is one reason doctrinal coherence is often not central in megachurches. The engine is not deep theological consistency, the engine is growth, vision, leadership, and institutional momentum. And even when the pastors do have degrees, the word degree can mean a lot of different things in the context of church. A small minority attended rigorous divinity schools or academically serious seminaries. Most attended Bible colleges, denominational schools, unaccredited institutions, doctrinally restricted programs, or leadership tracks explicitly designed to reinforce a religious brand instead of challenging ideas with academic rigor. In megachurch culture, credentials often function symbolically. They become part of the authority costume. Doctor, bishop, apostle, those titles can make the pastor look more intellectually grounded than the institution actually is. But a title doesn't mean academic rigor. A degree doesn't mean intellectual humility. And a large platform doesn't mean the theology has been carefully examined. In most cases, the credential is not what built the ministry. The growth of the ministry built the need for the credential. Let's talk about number 5. Megachurches are scalable, but not sustainable. Megachurches are good at scaling attendance, services, campuses, volunteers, media, and excitement. But scalability is not the same thing as sustainability. A church can add seats faster than it can add care. It can expand campuses faster than it can build accountability. It can grow vision faster than it can grow wisdom. That's where the machine starts to outgrow the roots. Megachurches often survive on donations and volunteer labor in a culture that teaches magical reimbursement. Give and God will give back. Serve and God will bless you. And sow into the vision and heaven will respond. That belief can bypass critical thinking. People give money they can't afford, volunteer time they don't have, and support major projects because questioning the vision feels like questioning God. So the church may look successful on the outside while becoming extremely fragile on the inside. Large crowds don't always mean sustainable giving. Expansion doesn't always mean stability, and momentum doesn't always mean maturity. And the evidence is often the number of broken lives that get lost in the process. Number four, megachurches are financially sustained by major donors. A megachurch crowd can create the appearance of unlimited resources, but large attendance does not automatically mean large giving. In many churches, the budget is not carried by everyone in the room, and most is carried by less than 20%. It's carried by a smaller core of consistent givers, major donors, and highly committed members. That matters because the crowd creates the image of momentum, but the donors create the budget. And in megachurches, the gap can be even wider. Some people assume the church is already wealthy, so they give less. Others attend for the music, childcare, community, or inspiration without ever becoming regular financial supporters. And as churches grow, they often attract more people who benefit from the system without contributing enough to sustain it. So the church can look massive while being financially fragile. More people means more parking, security, staff, programming, children's ministry, media production, facility cost, and pastoral care needs. But every additional person does not bring proportional giving. That creates a hidden tension. The church needs the crowd for legitimacy, but it needs the financial core for survival. Are you ready for number three? Megachurch pastors learn that God is not an active agent. This is one of the quietest tensions in megachurch leadership. Megachurch pastors may still sincerely believe in God, but the higher they rise, the more they're forced to behave as if God will not do what they often claim God does. They pray for growth, but still need marketing, conferences, systems, staff, and strategy. They pray for financial breakthrough, but still have to manage budgets, negotiate loans, court donors, and keep giving from collapsing. They pray for sick members, but they still have to face hospital rooms where nothing supernatural actually happens. And over time, that creates a shift. Either the pastor keeps believing God is going to do it, or they start realizing that they have to make it happen. Then they often spiritualize that pressure by saying, God is trusting me with this. That's where the contradiction becomes obvious. You don't have to manufacture miracles if you believe they can stand on their own. You don't have to manipulate timelines if God actually made it happen. You don't have to hide the mechanics if the miracle is real. But megachurch pastors live with too many unanswered prayers, too many failed prophecies, too many sick people who don't recover, too many budgets that don't balance, and too many promises that require human intervention in order to fulfill. So publicly, they preach dependence on God, but privately, they build systems that function as if God doesn't intervene. Number two, megachurch pastors are narcissists. But let me explain. When I say megachurch pastors are narcissists, I'm not saying that every megachurch pastor has narcissistic personality disorder. I'm saying megachurch culture naturally rewards and reproduces narcissistic traits: grandiosity, admiration dependency, image management, low accountability, spiritualized authority, and the belief that one person's vision represents the highest good. And in many ways, this is built into the theology. When a religious culture reveres an all powerful being who demands worship, obedience, surrender, loyalty, and constant praise, it should not surprise us when the visible leader begins to mirror those same traits. The pastor becomes the human reflection of the authority figure the community already worships, but the congregation is not passive in this. Members often crave a leader who mirrors that God complex. They want someone chosen, certain, powerful, anointed, untouchable, and larger than life. So they don't just tolerate the persona, they help create it. But there is another layer here: abandonment. Megachurch pastors often carry a complex abandonment wound shaped by two realities. First, they're constantly preaching about a God who is supposed to be active, but they have to live with God's absence in real time. Prayers go unanswered, people don't get healed, families fall apart, and members leave. Second, because the church is built around their persona, they often experience rejection from members as personal abandonment. People leave the church, question the vision, criticize the leader, or stop giving, and the pastor feels betrayed by the very people they believe they were called to serve. So the pastor builds a persona to protect against that abandonment and rejection. The persona becomes bigger, stronger, more certain, more anointed, more untouchable. And the more the pastor performs that authority, the more they resemble the divine authority figure the culture already reveres. So then, when narcissistic traits show up, the church calls it leadership. All right, are you ready for our number one secret that megachurch pastors don't want you to know? Let's dive in. Megachurch pastors have a blind spot in self awareness. One of the dangers of narcissistic leadership is that it creates a blind spot in self awareness. The pastor is not just overestimating their importance, they often begin to overestimate their knowledge, their wisdom, their discernment, their leadership ability, and their expertise. And the success of the church makes this worse. If the church is growing, if the room is full, if the money's coming in, if people are calling them anointed, it becomes easy for the pastor to believe their instincts are always right. But that success usually came from mechanics they may not fully understand. The branding, the timing, staff labor, donor strategy, social momentum, media, and organizational systems. All of that is getting collapsed into following the lead of the Spirit. When those mechanics get erased and the story becomes God is blessing my leadership, the pastor's self awareness gets distorted. That's where confidence starts getting mistaken for competence. A pastor can speak with authority on subjects they barely understand because they've learned how to sound certain. They can use small pieces of knowledge to dominate a conversation, shut down feedback, or avoid looking uninformed. And because the culture already treats them as chosen, people often confuse charisma with wisdom. This creates low intellectual humility. The pastor struggles to admit when they're wrong because being wrong threatens their image. New information becomes dangerous. Correction feels like dishonor. Disagreement feels like rebellion, and feedback feels like attack. So instead of growing in awareness, they often protect the persona. The pastor becomes the person least able to see what the system is doing to them because the system keeps rewarding them for not seeing it. Well, since this caught your attention enough for you to stick around, let's throw in a bonus, just to add some nuance. Megachurch pastors are losing a battle with depression. Now, this bonus point matters because the megachurch machine doesn't only harm members, it also harms the people running it. Megachurch pastors often stand in front of thousands while privately carrying isolation, burnout, public scrutiny, family pressure, staff conflict, donor expectations, and the impossible burden of always appearing strong. And the data backs this up. Barna reported that 65% of pastors experience loneliness or isolation. That's up from 42% in 2015. Barna also reported that among pastors who feel more alone, 26% said they had faced thoughts of self harm or suicide in the past year. Now, that's the tragedy of the model. The same system that elevates pastors also isolates them. If they admit they're depressed, people may question their faith. If they admit that they're overwhelmed, people may question their calling. If they admit that the vision is too heavy, people may question whether God gave it to them. So they suffer in silence. So this critique is not about hating pastors. It's about telling the truth about a system that manufactures miracles, rewards narcissism, hides weakness, and then crushes the very people it calls anointed. The point is not just to hate on megachurches. The point is to understand how systems perpetuate harm. And in the case of megachurches, it's a tricky study because the systems they use to grow are strictly secular, though often wrapped in supernatural language. There's nothing mysterious or miraculous about megachurch growth. It's social science in action. And the growth is not the problem. The systems are not the problem. The outreach, the music, the giveaways, the Sunday concerts are not the problem. The big buildings are not the problem. They're often representative of real solutions for members in that local community. The problem is the culture. The systems are healthy, the culture is sick. Mega churches are evidence that even when Christianity gets better systems, it still doesn't produce better people. As long as the culture is tied to doctrines that represent misunderstandings from the past, it's going to repeat mistakes from the past. So for me, the bigger problem isn't that mega churches exist. Who cares? The bigger problems are the lessons they rob their members of by hiding the mechanics, the pressure they put on staff and leaders to be the man behind the curtain, and the harm that gets spiritualized because health is not prioritized. If we can ever learn how to see the humans behind the harm, then maybe we can find more humane ways to help. Now, speaking of ways to help, over the past 2 years, we've been working hard behind the scenes and on Sundays on providing alternative frameworks for community in a post religious reality. Now, we meet on Sundays because most people are off of work, and we have a virtual campus where members connect with each other from across the globe throughout the week. We have workshops, movie nights, and we're now creating music together, which is really awesome. It's a whole vibe, and we're just getting started. This year, we've already grown by more than 120 members. We've hosted a food drive, and we've even raised money for a nonprofit that targets food insecurities in schools. At Bridge City, we're not just doing good without God, we're doing better. And that's kind of the whole point. Bridge City exists to help people connect better, build better, and live better because that's what empowers us all to do better. Because we're committed to seeing the humans behind the harm, we're creating space that is intentionally forward thinking, people centric, and life affirming. And so, if you're serious about helping make a positive difference in this world and helping steer this ship further away from the perils of religious superstition, then I can guarantee you that being connected to a community is in your best interest. Check out Bridge City today. The link is in the description. That's all I have for now, friends. Thank you for joining me today. And until next time, keep rising.